So, yeah, 1 second. All right. So let's see how far we can get into his account of nature today. So we had begun discussing book 2, chapter 1, and discussing his initial distinction between things that are by nature and things that are due to other causes. So this distinction is the first step he takes after establishing the change is possible in the first book that we belabored quite extensively. So given that change is possible, what kind of change is there? And he gives us this, what he considers to be an evident difference of kinds of change, things that move themselves, and things that are moved by some external force. And it's important that we don't, when we think of things that move themselves, we have to think of them this way, that there to be that thing is to have an internal principle, an internal cause of motion that partly explains the motions that it is capable of. And that is why his big distinction is not between the organic and the inorganic, like it is for us, right? Because rocks are made of earth, and because they're made of earth, they have the earthen internal principle, which is to tend towards the center or to fall. Right? So rocks and what we call inorganic nature is all bound up with inner principles of motion, intrinsic motion. So the elements that all physical things are composed of, right, earth, air, fire, and water, each one of these has its own internal principle of motion. Hence, fire rises, for instance. And above and beyond these, there are also things that move themselves in a different way insofar as they develop, and they develop toward themselves. They mature, they develop. And he calls these animals, plants, animals and plants, basically. So we get this initial understanding of things that are moved because of their own nature. They are moved by nature. Nature is a cause. Nature is not a thing. We tend to think of nature as a thing, something that some big totality in which all sorts of events are interconnected, and that natural science explains to us. He doesn't think of nature this way. He thinks of it, he introduces it prepositionally and adverbally, things that move naturally or by nature. And at the beginning of book 3, he says, nature itself is a starting point of movement and change, right? It is, which is to say, it is a cause. So in order to contrast this, he doesn't contrast the organic with the inorganic and say, well, the inorganic is just a bunch of things that don't have any inner principle of movement. He says that that anything earthen will fall, and anything on fire or gaseous will rise. And so that's not an external force. That's just these things expressing their nature. So the relevant contrast is not with the inorganic world, which is full of its own laws, its own regularities, and therefore has its own principles of motion. But rather with the contrast is made with techne, with things that are made by craft, right? Right. So Latin will be artifacts, right? Things made by art. So that's the relevant contrast, and interestingly enough, he is going to not only make this contrast, but he's going to show how each one of these different domains, the domain of self-movement and the domain of craft, are illuminating of one another. And that's one of the questions I left us with at the end of last time is, how, if these are so different, how come they illuminate one another? So that's one of the things we want to keep in the back of our mind when we're reading. So that's just kind of as recapitulation. And so before we move on to book 2 and read together a couple, book 2, chapter 2, and read a couple paragraphs together, is there anything in particular you wanted to ask about, or thoughts that book 1 raised that we didn't get to last time that you wanted to introduce? And he makes the basic distinction, and then he begins to reflect on this. The thinkers of his time, some of them thought that that what is natural, what is by nature, is fundamentally matter, and others thought of it as fundamentally form. And so he goes through a sequence of steps, which are quite interesting, but might take us a long time to get through, where he weighs the pros and cons of thinking about natural motion, things that move by nature, naturally, in terms of matter, and then in terms of form. And then at 193b 7, so that's on page 22 in our Reeve edition, towards the top, he comes to his conclusion. In fact, so that's the first full paragraph. In fact, the form is more nature than the matter is. So we have a winner, folks. For each thing is said to be when it actually is, more than when it potentially is. So the only reason I'm pointing that out is because he does go back and forth on this throughout this text, and we see each time that when he resolves it with the concepts of actuality and potentiality, which, since this question is fundamentally a metaphysical one, we see the importance of the actuality and potentiality couplet for even his physical investigations. So I just wanted to kind of point that was going on, and give you a chance, just in case you were mulling over something you wanted to bring up last week, or last time we were together reading this text and were unable to, or upon reading the new sections, maybe there's something you want to talk about a little bit from book 1 before we move on. Do you have any takers, or should we move on to book 2, which is fine with me too? Philip, thank you.
Just very quickly on that section you just read, I mean, taking it in the most literal way, in fact, the form is more nature than the matter is. Is that actually supposed to suggest that, well, matter is a little bit nature, but form is more? Like, are we actually supposed to see form as distributed between nature and matter, and nature just has more of it? I mean, that does seem to be what he's literally saying, at least in this translation.
Right. That I think it would be. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to think about it in those almost quantitative terms, distributed that way. So I think it's the idea is it is there are lots of different viewpoints to look at a natural being doing its natural thing, and all 4 of the causes are relevant to that. But if we're looking for an explanatory framework that tries to get at the being of the thing under investigation, then it is more appropriate to privilege form over matter than matter over form. And he'll give us some reasons for that in the course of this chapter. But here he's basically announcing it. He did, like I said, he did give us a little bit of an argument here, but unless people want to dig into it, which I'm totally open to. I wasn't planning on digging into it today, but I'm flexible. Brendan.
First, I think it might just be kind of like he's weighing the evidence here,
Yeah.
right? When he says more, he means there's more logic, or the more logical statements, or something like that. But when he says more, he's going to be talking about like a quantity. So he's not saying that he's not talking about nature and matter as if they always only constitute quantity here.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think, but Philip, I want to say that's a good question, because that's the kind of question that gets us to focus more specifically on what Aristotle might actually be after, even though his words direct us perhaps in a different direction. So I really like those kind of questions, because they're taking the language quite literally, and it gets us to dig into those passages to see whether the literal rendition makes more sense, or whether it needs to be taken in a different sense. All right. Oh, Mike, hey, good to see you.
All right, I'll take you up on your offer.
Beautiful.
The second sentence, I'm trying to grok that, but oh no, yeah, for each thing is said to be when it actually is. Oh, I
What
lost
page
it.
you want me to be on?
Oh yeah.
Oh, the same one you were on.
Okay.
Yep.
The one you highlighted, Bo.
Yeah, so for each thing is said to be when it actually is more than what it potentially is.
Right. So how do you understand that? I mean, what's your initial way of unlocking that secret?
So I'm going to throw it out there, and then I won't, and then we'll forget I said it. But it's essence, it's beingness, or what it is to be. It's more important to look at its actuality than what is potential in it.
That's right. That's right. But let's try to cash it out, right? I mean, so for me, the first thing that occurs to me is when I buy something at IKEA. Right. My bookshelves in the IKEA box are potentially a bookshelf, but they're not actually a bookshelf. And so it is more proper so it's only when the raw materials have the form of the bookshelf that they're actually the bookshelf. In the IKEA box, they're potentially the bookshelf, but they're not yet. And so he's saying if we have the choice to call the bookcase or the bookshelves the actualized completed one, or the potential that there's a person around who can put these raw materials together according to the proper form, we'll say that the bookshelf is actually the actual bookshelf and not the potential bookshelf.
I love it. That's one of the few times where it actually makes sense. I see that in either case, the unmade bookshelf that's in the box, and then after you put your techne in it or whatever, and it becomes the form of the bookshelf as well. But in each case, the before and after, the matter is still the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Although the matter's, of course, been changed because it's not in the form that it was when it was in the box, right? But it's not been changed with respect to its being matter. It's only been changed with respect to its form.
Okay. Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just reading Aristotle makes you an expert in things like qua and in respect of. You really notice how much nuance those expressions actually bring to your thought, because they really make you focus on specific respects and thereby tune out other respects that aren't relevant. But yeah, so if I fall into the trap of talking that way too much, please someone upbraid me. But for the purposes of clarity, I think sometimes helps. I got Clark and then Philip.
Yeah. By the way, I'm working and I can't
stay on the call. I'm not sure what my schedule is going to be. I'm going to have a client calling. So anyway,
Okay, gotcha.
So I'm a little uneasy, though.
Yes.
I have this weird relationship. I mean, I'm glad you focused on that. The fact is, you know, what he's saying there, because and I'm getting how it is that, in a way, why he's saying it the way he's saying it.
Yeah.
And yet I'm also uneasy because there's a bit of an opportunism, it seems to me, in the use of language here. He's making a distinction between form and matter in respect to nature.
Yeah.
And I know that if I actually think about that and carry that to a kind of logical place, the whole relationship between form and matter collapse to me, because they become non sequiturs. Because there's no way that something can exist without matter, except in our minds, except as in our imaginations. And if you take the form and matter and take them, you know, you always ask yourself, we did this months ago, you know, I think we had a discussion about this, but you take something and you keep asking, okay, so that is form and matter. And then what's the form and matter of that? And then you keep going deeper regressively until you get form without matter. And by definition, matter cannot be understood at all. I mean, nor can form at that point. So I am confused about how to cognate these distinctions that are being made and whether to trust them.
Understood.
They make sense in a limited sense, in a limited narrative sense, in a context that you define. But of course, that doesn't define actual intelligibility. That's a story we tell about what could be intelligible. But if it's not consistent all the way down the regressive, you know, infinite regress, then what do we really have by making these distinctions? So it's kind of more of a general concern.
Understood. No, I appreciate that comment. Yep. I'm gonna let the other voices get in here and see if you guys get into a conversation before I jump in. But so I got Philip and then Peter.
I have a short and simple point. I'm reading both the Reeve and also the big Jonathan Barnes anthology, The Complete Works of Aristotle. And in the Barnes, that sentence I mentioned is really clear. It just says, the form indeed is nature rather than the matter. Done. Very simple, very clear. Now, whether that clarity supports what Michael said and how Michael interpreted this, and, you know, then the question arises, is the Greek clear and the Barnes people got it right? Is the Greek unclear and Reeve accurately represents that lack of clarity? I'm not qualified to answer that, but I just thought I'd throw it out that at least the Barnes is clear on this in favor of Michael's reading.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. It's a rare treat to be supported. Now I have to refer back to the Greek, but I'm just going to let Peter have his opportunity here.
Yeah, sorry I'm late. I got caught up in work and completely forgot the time.
But you and Tyler both, I guess.
Anyway, I was just I came in late, and maybe I've already discussed this, but in response to Clark, on form and matter, it's in the physics, and I think a couple other places. He does say, Aristotle does make the point that some things are separable only in the mind. For instance, in form and matter, those are separable only in the mind, never in reality. You can never have a form just hanging by itself. You can never have matter just shapeless, right? It can be in a shape it's not easy to describe, but we can only separate them in our mind. So that was one thing. And also, I think that roughly speaking, this form matter thing is more like is really. Have you gotten into the relation with actuality and possibility with respect to form and matter?
Just no, not with respect to form and matter. No.
Yeah, because the form is kind of like the actuality that the form that it's taking right now, as it were. And the matter of the thing is the set of potentialities that it could take, as like a tree. Its potential, the nature of a tree includes the potentialities of being an acorn, of being a seedling, a sapling, a big tree. You know, I guess when it's knocked over and dead, it's no longer has a nature because it's not alive. But so those are all the those are all the potentialities. That collection of potentialities is kind of like the substance of the thing, or the nature. It's nature's that set of things it could do, and its current form. If it's a sapling, it's taken, that's its actuality. That's its current thing, and it will change as it develops.
Do you want to respond, Clark, or you want to think about it, or?
Oh yeah, I'm here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate that, Peter. I think I mean that fits with how I've been thinking about form and matter is something that exists in our mind, and that right there kind of captures it. I want to know exactly what I can trust if my mind is not. I don't notice that my mind is always trustworthy, right? I mean, my imagination is part of my mind. Well, and I mean, I'm not trying to be skeptical here. I think this is a question that a lot of people might have about this.
I just want to clarify. I would say you slightly mischaracterized what I was trying to say. I was not trying to say that form and matter exist only in the mind. What I was trying to say was that they can be separated. They can be considered separately only in the mind. The separation can only happen in the mind. We can consider the form of something without regard to its matter.
Yep, you're right. I apologize. I missed that. Yep. You can't pick up the form of something, you shake out all the matter, be left holding the form. I mean, that doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah, right. Can I just say something slightly orthogonal to this? I'm just going to raise a question and for people to ponder, right? But a lot of Aristotle's work revolves around this potentiality that is itself form, and that's a little bit difficult to understand. But I want to say, so for instance, this cup, right? Made of porcelain. It has the possibility of breaking, but it's not broken. Is that possibility only in the mind or not? Or is that the wrong framework for understanding the possibility of the cup that the cup has to break? Now, we can go a lot of different directions here, but I think it's clear to say that, well, the possibility of the cup breaking is only in the mind and not in the cup. And really what we want to say that the cup only has whatever porcelain is composed of, right? And the possibility isn't in it. And if it's not in it, it must be out of it somewhere, and out of it somewhere, it's not in some other thing. So it must be in the mind, whatever that is. So I just wanted to raise that question for thinking about, where is the possibility, or is even where is it, other than in the cup that has that possibility. And if it's in the cup, but it's not a physical constituent of the cup, then there's more to the cup than its physical composition. And that's what we're getting at here. There's more to things than their physical makeup. And anyway, so sorry, I wanted to raise that and for people to ponder. And I got a hand from Philip.
Yeah. So out in the world, the cup might have the potential to be broken, but it has no actuality of being broken. But interestingly, in the mind, you could consider the actual state of affairs of the cup being broken.
Yeah.
So that must be relevant in some way. I'm not sure exactly how, but in the mind, one can contemplate the potential of the cup to break, but we can also consider the cup in a broken form, even though that does not correspond to anything in the world as things are now. And that's got to be relevant somehow. Maybe somebody can follow up on that.
Well, Mike, go ahead and follow up on that. Or ask something else. You don't have to follow up if you don't want.
I guess maybe thinking of it another way, where I'm thinking it's not just in the mind. So the cup has the potential to be broken, which I think does belong in the cup somehow. And the reason I say that is one can also think the cup has the potential to become Taylor Swift, right? And that won't happen. It is something inherent in the cup. I don't know.
No, I like that. I like that. And here, but okay, so I mean, part of the task of understanding the cup and the statue is retroactively to begin to understand thought or mind, and not come rushing to judgment with our assumptions about what mind is and all the rest of it that well that just hasn't been scrutinized yet. So let's let mind come into focus through the examination of nature and ask, and so yeah, and not come to our not come to too many conclusions based on our assumptions about what mind is or the way our culture talks about it. All right, Peter, you got your hand up.
Yeah, so the couple things. One is technically, as I understand it, a cup mug wouldn't have a nature because it's an artifact, or right?
Right.
So setting that aside, still the nature, sort of the substance, the matter of a cup, it has its form imposed on, it has its nature, certain, I can't say nature given from outside. How does he articulate it? Its essence is given from the artisan. Anyway,
its form, yeah, its form comes from the artisan, yeah.
Right. So, but as far as the potentials, because Mike was saying that, well, it's not that the cup does not have the potential to be Taylor Swift, right? And that's true, because though it's not part of its substance, that's part of it. The essence of it is kind of like the bundle of potentialities it can have.
Right.
Being Taylor Swift singing, that's not part of what it is to be a cup. Things like holding liquid, being roughly human hand size, whatever else you want to put in there. And you can argue about exactly where the boundaries of all that is. That's not the important thing. But, and also as a cup, it's not even breakable, qua cup. Piece of porcelain. Yeah, you can shatter into a lot of pieces. Qua steel, it's probably not, if it's a steel mug, well, it's going to be, you can bend it and fold it and melt it. It'll have different things, but that's not its cup. That is, that's hunk of steel,
right,
etc.
No, that's nice. I mean, and that gets us back to the qua, right? It's breakable qua porcelain, but not qua cup.
As is how he says it a lot.
Yeah, or with respect, but you can't break the form cup. It comes and goes. Okay, cool. Let me see. Brendan.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm on my phone right now.
I can.
Okay, good. So I just wanted to say one funny thing and one thing that actually is pertinent. So one thing is that depending on how hot the cup is, if it's around room temperature, I bet there would be enough mass energy to make a Taylor Swift out of a cup. Especially, and then if you had the techne to like take all that really, I think it would be really cold mass energy and turn it into something that has all the same atoms as Taylor Swift, specified like at whatever age or whatever state you're talking about. That would be possible. But just to bring it back to Aristotle, I was just wondering, since we're talking about forms, does anyone relevant or like Plato or whatever actually tell us how form works in relation to matter? Like, what would Aristotle be thinking of form and matter as being, as in terms of like location? Since we're saying that we're not talking about I'm not talking about a psyche right now. We're not talking about the mind, because Aristotle doesn't bring up the mind. But wouldn't it just be kind of like obvious to him, like forms act like this, they're X and Y and Z, and maybe he says something about the psyche being involved with that. But yeah, so I was just wondering if that was available in your knowledge?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I don't quite understand. I don't quite understand your question. I was kind of, interested. You try one more time. I heard one thing about Plato.
Peter was talking about, Peter was talking about the forms residing in the mind in a certain way.
Yeah.
And then you redirected him to say that Aristotle doesn't necessarily talk about where the forms come from, and so, or how they act with relation to the mind. But I was wondering if there was kind of, if you had ever, whether Aristotle had in his mind, how it is that forms relate to the mind. Do you see what I mean?
Oh yeah, no, yeah. He does say that I remember now, to be honest, I don't remember if it's the soul or the mind, but he says that, you know, the mind is the place of the forms, right? And so, but that's not saying that my personal, you know, interior life that I call mind, which isn't really mind at all, is I've got my own bunch of forms, and you have your all bunch of forms, and everybody, and there's no way to find out if those forms are the same forms, which would get us in the same thing. You know, it's like when you say ouch, do you have the same qualia that I do when I say ouch? And we will never know, right? And so we don't want to automatically just pose these things, these questions in this way that make them unanswerable based on the assumptions that we're importing that are not Aristotle's. And maybe Aristotle isn't bothered by these kinds of constructions because he doesn't make those assumptions. Yeah, but anyway, that's for what it's worth. That's what I have to say. Peter, go ahead.
I just want to re-clarify that I think I haven't made this. I was only saying one thing was in the mind, the separability of form and matter.
Right.
Now I'm not in my previous comments, both Brendan and whoever else,
Clark,
sort of assume that in the mind. I neither said matter was in the mind nor that was not in the mind. All I said is that if you're going to consider them separately, that can only happen in the mind. And I didn't mean to take a position earlier. I mean, yes, I agree that forms are part of the mind, right? Or in the mind, but I did not say that earlier. I just want to clarify that. I was only saying that if form and matter can be separated, that can only happen in our mind, not in reality, as it were, however that cashes out.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, so we're here keeping our minds open. Somehow we can't avoid puns on mind now. I don't know if you remember that little diagram. I'm not going to pop it up here again, but it was like two overlapping circles with an area in the center. I don't know if you can, right? And that area in the center is what I wanted to call mind. And on the one side, you have like world or something like that, or objects of perception. And the other side, you have subjective impressions. And, you know, things that are radically personal, and mind doesn't belong to either one of them, but his mind is where they overlap. So I just want, I'm not saying you need to accept that. I'm saying I would like you to use it as a hypothesis for thinking about some of the things that Aristotle is saying, and perhaps convince you that the way you think about mind as here's world and here's mind, and we never know if there's any intersection at all, that this model doesn't make sense of science, doesn't make sense of logic, does not make sense of two people understanding each other in a conversation. It doesn't make sense of very much, and yet it is persistent as heck that we come at it with this. There's the object and there's the subject, and we never know if they ever if they ever meet, if they ever overlap, if they ever identical, right? And if you start with this, then yeah, those are all correct inferences. But the real question is on what basis do you allow yourself to start this way? Because the start is the foundation of everything else. And so if you start this way, without wondering if it's the true and best starting point, then all of your correct inferences from there will just bear the mark of this dubious beginning. So that's part of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to introduce the other hypotheses or other ways to think about the relationship between mind and world that might be able to make sense of logic and science and communication and translatability between languages and all these other phenomena that just are made impossible by this original model. And nobody wants to say they're impossible. And so we should probably at least bracket this model for a while to see if there are other tenable models. Philip.
Yeah, the point Peter has made a few times I think is really important, and we should talk about that more.
Excellent.
Because it has the potential, if true, and I think it is true, to get out a lot of potential, bad word, to get out some metaphysical weirdness that it's possible to read into Aristotle, but you don't have to read into it, right? Like we're obviously, or some philosophers, Plato, others, are tempted to say that form is metaphysically some separate thing, and then the matter is metaphysically some separate thing. And Peter keeps saying that these things are only separable in the mind. I think we can even get rid of the word mind. We can say that they are separable in our consideration, or, I mean, to use Arbogast-Smith's word, we can say they are separable. We can discriminate them as separable, might be how Arbogast-Smith would say it. So, like, there are ways of getting around even having the mind as a metaphysical thing in all of this. And it just seems like maybe we could compare it to something where we're not tempted to take a metaphysical turn, okay? Let's say you buy me a birthday cake, and it makes me happy. Nobody is tempted to say, oh, there's a happiness-inducing quality out there in the world that is a self-subsisting, self-contained entity, and it's there, and we could, talk about it. No, nobody's tempted to do that, right? Nobody's tempted to make the metaphysical turn. But if we consider that, form and matter might just be these things that become apparent as we consider things around us, and that's all there is to it, we've sort of gotten rid of any potential metaphysical weirdness, and maybe that's important and maybe it isn't.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. And I think that's, we definitely want to defer metaphysical weirdness as long as possible until we're sure we got to go there. So here for that. Mike, get your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I had to step out and take one of my dogs out. I did want to go back to something that I said earlier in terms of when you were saying the breakability or whatever of a cup.
Right.
Is it in the cup or is it in our mind? And I had answered in a way that might seem like it was in the cup and outside of us. So I said in the cup doesn't have the potential to become Taylor Swift, right? And then when I thought that, I was like, oh, okay, then that's something in the cup that's outside of the mind, but I don't think that's true either. Because if it were, then there could be an infinite number of determinations that cup could become, like that cup could become, a letter. I'm just looking at the things around me, or a chair. And all of those things in a way would be discrete, and I could never account for all of them. What am I trying to say? So that I know that a cup couldn't become Taylor Swift is also not something that's in the cup. It is also something in the mind, if that makes sense. Because if it really were in the cup, I could never go through all the infinite possibilities of what it could or couldn't become. that's impossible. If it were outside of me.
Right.
Outside of my
Yeah.
mind.
Go ahead, Peter.
So this is going to be good fodder for the early part of the Schmidt topics, because we've confused the well-determined object for the object.
Mm.
It's so maybe I'm going to mischaracterize things here, but it's almost as if Mike was saying, like, thinking the cup was some pile of atoms made of ceramic sitting on his table or something like that. Well, there's certainly a pile of stuff on his table, right? That's fine. But I don't think, well, actually, the table isn't even out there either, in a sense. The cup's not out there, the table's not out there. What is it to be a cup? What it is to be a cup isn't some magical property of all these atoms that happen to have this form, right? So in other words, to say that the cup, and to refer, it's not necessarily wrong to refer to this thing I'm picking up as the cup, but really the cupness is more of a mental thing, or it's and it is only a cup because we have this way of, I'm not sure exactly how to articulate it, form, or is that the right word? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it is.
Peter, I do agree with you, and I think I was really not explicating it well, but I was also talking about the potentialities, and going back to Michael's question, whether, the potential for a cup to break, is it in, well, anyway, whatever.
Yeah.
Is it in the atoms that are out there? And I don't know. You know what? These are still nascent thoughts. I think they're mumble jumble.
It was meant to provoke. It was meant to provoke a conversation, and really to provoke questioning about, about questioning about how to think about the mind and the mind's contribution, and especially whether the mind is equal to my personal thoughts, because obviously my personal thoughts about 1 + 1 is equal to 2 is not the objective fact that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. But 1 + 1 is equal to 2 is only intelligible. It's not perceivable. So this whole intelligibility thing that we get with mathematics is what Plato wanted people to study for about 10 years and just get used to ideal relations, ideal objects. Because once you do that, you won't constantly think that they're just, that the triangle is in your perception, or, or that when we do geometry, we're actually studying physical objects. Right. So there's the intelligibility. It is mental, or it is noetic, but it's not personal or subjective. And we just have to create room for exploring the possibility of this dimension of what we call mind. And the Greeks open us up to it and show all these necessary relations and necessary objects that are intelligible only, but not products of the imagination, and not subjective, and not different for each individual. And it's that bundle of properties that make them neither physical nor psychological, in the sense of belonging only to me, the way my memories belong only to me. 1 + 1 = 2 does not belong to me in the same way that my memory of my fifth birthday belongs to me. And so we need to make, we've evoked Schmidt, we need to make the relevant discriminations in order to begin to comprehend what it is we're even talking about when we use the word like mind or intelligible. Anyway, go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, potentially one way to not be anachronistic about Aristotle is to look at the full range of ways that we could be anachronistic. Okay, so we've been exploring the idea that there's a cup out there in the world, and then consideration of the cup in my mind. Okay, so we all know that this is an anachronistic way. This is not a way that the Greeks, not a way of thinking that came easily to the Greeks. Okay, but here's another anachronistic way. You could say that the cup exists in some sort of life world, Lebenswelt, right? You could say that I inhabit a human reality of some sort. I inhabit like a life world in which cups show up, and the cup is a physical object. The cup plays a role in the human reality that I inhabit. Notice that that in this way, we don't have to evoke mind, but we've still got meaningful things, right? The cup is still meaningful. It still plays a role in a human context, and it's a physical thing, and there isn't necessarily a big division there, right? And if we want, we could go down into like a Heidegger kind of direction with this, okay? So that would be another anachronism that we could apply. And perhaps we could generate more, but like the full range of anachronistic ways of reading Aristotle that are available to us might be useful, like to just sort of, you know, that in itself might be a way of getting out of thinking about it as like some, you know, we're sort of locked in our heads thinking about cups, and then there's the world out there, and oh, we want to connect to it, but we can't because we're locked in our heads. Like there's other anachronisms we could apply.
Right. Yeah, that might be an interesting thing to catalog, but it would get us, maybe we should do that on an off Thursday so that we can get to the text. I think I like the suggestion. Charlie.
Hi. I'm not sure I understand. I've been missing a couple sessions, but I'm probably behind here. I'm not sure I understand the conversation completely, but an easy way I think of thinking about matter and form is just to think about everything and to think about all matter as just matter, period. And that the forms are those things that individuate matter, that make matter to be different in this way and that way, to have different objects, to have different things, and everything has a form. And I think at one point I read this someplace, I can't tell you where, that Aristotle said not to get too hung up on absolutely each form that something would have as it goes through change. Because you could be talking about that in ad infinitum or ad infinitum.
Mm-hmm.
And, but if you just think of everything, what is it? Why is there a cat and why is there a cup and why is there a truck? It's because of the forms that inform the matter.
Mm-hmm.
And the matter is simply there. It's and its job is to receive, to be potential,
Mm-hmm.
to have this potency to receive these forms.
Mm-hmm.
And as Peter's very clearly said, and very well said, I think, that we know this by understanding it. We don't know it because we can have matter separately from a form. You can't have them separate. They can't be separate. They are always together. And the form is active. The matter is passive. And that I think it's kind of, maybe, I don't know if it's helpful or not, but at any rate, if you can just think of everything and the various forms are what cause us to cognize or cause us to understand differences in things and of individual things. And that's when you can talk about substances and qualities and quantities and things of that sort. And then just one other little point. I've been looking here, but I can't find it. I think in the metaphysics, in that very first part of the metaphysics, Aristotle made the comment that nature is that which makes something to be what it is. And it's of course not all the trees and woods and streams and things. The nature of something is as Michael's been talking about it, is something that causes something to be how and what it is, and things do things by nature. And it seems to me that the term form and the term nature and the term essence in Aristotle are very, very closely related. They actually are talking about the same thing, but from a different aspect of that, a different aspect of a substance. A substance has a form, it has a nature, it has an essence. And as you talk about all these different things that inhere in a substance, which is composed of matter and form, they're all different aspects of it. Well, that's my comment. I don't know if that's helpful or
no, it's
understandable. I don't know if it's even understandable, I hope.
Let's piggyback on Charlie's and Philip's remarks and look at book 2, chapter 2, because he actually does perform, Aristotle performs for us a separation. And maybe we can get a little bit clearer on it when we read the text. So this is the top of page 23. So Aristotle sets this up by saying, now that we've distinguished the ways in which things are said to be by nature, or said to be nature, we need to get a theoretical grasp, right, on how the mathematician differs from the natural scientist. And you're like, what? Why do we have to get a grasp on that right now? But we really only understand this point towards the end of this chapter. So let's look at it. All right. So he makes the point, that he says at the bottom of 22, whether astronomy is distinct from natural science, and that is the science of what is naturally. Natural science is the natural scientist is the physicos, and this is the person who studies motion insofar as it's an inner principle of things. So he's looking at changing things that change because of their inner principle. That's what a natural scientist is. It's a very, very well-defined and very narrow discipline. So when he says natural scientist, that's what he means. Now, whether astronomy is distinct from natural science or a part of it, for if it belongs to the natural scientist to know what the sun or the moon is, for him not to know their intrinsic coincidence would be absurd, i.e. that they're round. But roundness, circularity, is a mathematical topic. And so the question is the natural scientist doing mathematics when she does astronomy? Or is the mathematician actually doing physics when they study lines and planes and circles? And yeah, so let's look and see what Aristotle has to say about this. So at the top of page 23, now, the mathematician too busies himself about these things, namely Earth, Moon, Sun, Cosmos. Although not insofar as each of them is the limit of a natural body, a body that moves according to an inner principle. Nor does he get a theoretical grasp on the coincidence of natural bodies insofar as they are such. That is why he separates them. For they are separable in the understanding from movement. And so their being separated makes no difference, nor does any falsehood result from it. Let's just stop there. And given our conversation we've just had, let's take stock. What is the mathematician doing? He's one thing I'm just going to say, the mathematician is not studying figments of the imagination. He's not conjuring up things that belong to him personally, like a unicorn or like some beast or monster, and admiring the inner pictures of them, right? He's studying lines, planes, circles, triangles, all the rest of it. So anything else that jumps out at you, given our past conversation in this paragraph, right? What separating is? Peter.
Well, the natural scientist is, it's okay for the mathematician. Well, a natural scientist can't necessarily separate the form of the natural body he's studying from his study of it, right? So, I mean, it's necessarily going to be part of his inquiry is that it's part of it, that is the form of a natural body that has an inner principle. Whereas there is no like inner principle, there's no nature to a triangle in a sense, because it's not like an inner principle of change. Triangles don't
exactly
change, actually.
The triangles don't change on their own.
So the mathematician is free to consider triangle qua its shape, as it were. I'm not sure I want to use form. Yeah, form. He can separate that because he's not doing violence to the object under study, because the object under study isn't the whole thing. It's just this aspect of it. And so he is no longer down. He's no longer at the natural science level. He's at the mathematical level, I guess.
Right. So he's not. So we're not. So the mathematician studies the circle, but not. Here we're going to use this word, abstracted from the limits of natural bodies. Let's say moving stars. It's not like I take all the stars that I can see and get some kind of composite circle. I trace them all on top of each other and get some kind of composite circle. And then I study that. That would be the objective geometry. That's what geometry studies. That would be including the natural limit, the limit of natural bodies in my topic of conversation. And therefore, I would never be discussing anything that has the ideal properties of, the periphery being equidistant from the center. I never have a circle with those properties. So, so the mathematician is able to separate out the circle as distinct from circular things. And he says, no falsehood results from this. We are not distorting the circle by separating it out. We are not making erroneous statements about circles by separating them out. But the next paragraph, he's going to say, but you can't separate everything out. Some things are separable and some things aren't. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Peter, for that. That helped. I do have one question. So in that same paragraph, in the last sentence, for they are separable in the understanding from movement.
Right.
Why did he put movement there?
Because he's talking about natural bodies, and natural bodies move.
Okay.
That's what makes them natural.
Okay.
It's just a terminological thing.
As opposed to like a static, like.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, that's important because, natural bodies move. Therefore, spherical bodies move. Therefore, spheres move. Therefore, if I'm a geometer, I should be examining moving spheres. Right. That would be the case if I were merely abstracting. But what Aristotle is pointing us to is that you can completely separate them not only from the bodies they limit. That's important. They limit these bodies. These are limits. These are ideal limits. But I'm not falsifying anything by what I say about them in their separation. All right, Philip?
There's something I feel should be in our minds as background information when we're talking about this. The concept of what a mathematician was changing rapidly at this point. Like the Babylonians and the Egyptians, they were using the Pythagorean formula, not theorem, but just the formula to calculate areas and all that kind of stuff for 3,000 years. They were using it to figure out areas and whatnot, and nobody ever thought to prove the thing. So the Greeks had this, invented the idea of proof. And this was sort of revolutionizing what it meant to be a mathematician. I'm just saying that the whole idea of what it was to be a mathematician was in flux at the time of Aristotle. And I think that sometimes he might be leaning more towards that mathematician is like a practical person who has a collection of formulas that work. They don't know why, they just know that they work, versus the newer idea of a mathematician as somebody who proved these formulas and turned them into theorems.
Right.
I just feel it should be background information. I don't know exactly how it's going to fit in, but.
All right, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, so let's read the next paragraph and see if we can find out why the Platonists fail where the mathematicians succeed. So those who speak about the ideas do this too, separate from movement, though it escapes their notice. For they separate natural objects, though these are less separable than mathematical ones. This will become clear if one were to try to state the definitions both of the objects themselves and their coincidence. For odd and even, straight and curved, and furthermore number, line, and figure will be without movement, whereas flesh, bone, and human will not. But rather all of them are said of things just as snub nose is, and not as curved is. This is also clear from the more natural science-like parts of mathematics, such as optics, harmonics, and astronomy. For these are, in a way, the reverse of geometry. For whereas geometry investigates natural lines, but not as natural, optics investigates mathematical lines, but not as mathematical. All right, so what's different? Peter?
Well, first of all, I just want to point out that this is something that was clarified. I think it's in Reeves' notes in the back, but it says the definition of a snub nose is a nose that has a concave curve to it.
Right.
Which is why when he says as snub nose is and not as curved is, that's why you would think of curved with snub nose. It's concaved inwards. But his overall point here, of course, is that the natural objects have movement, and you can't consider them without the movement. I mean, the definition of a natural object is it's as a principle of an inner principle of movement and rest.
Right.
So the snub nose can be considered as a snub nose. It's that concave curve to it, but you can't talk about it without maybe it wrinkling up. That's also part of it. Whereas the mathematical line, concave, can be considered without considering movement, because the mathematical objects are not tied up. They're qua mathematical object. They are not necessarily related to movement or associated with the movement, whereas the natural objects are.
Right. And this whole movement thing, you just remember, that nature is an inner principle of motion. So anything natural will have an inner principle of motion. So if we're going to separate out the idea of flesh, well, flesh can't be flesh without movement, but the idea won't have movement. And so we're falsifying flesh by thinking of it as an immovable thing, as an immovable ideal thing, in a way that we're not falsifying the circle, and when it's separated, because the circle itself is not in motion, but only the natural body that it limits is in motion.
Which is what his snarky remark at the beginning, those who speak about the ideas do this too. That people who think about the ideas separate the natural objects from the form from their natural objects. And that's not, I'm trying to consider them separately, and that just doesn't work, is his roughly bigger point there, right?
I think so. Do you want to restate it?
Did I not just restate it?
I didn't follow you quite. Sorry.
Oh, well, the first one was just that those who speak about the ideas, Plato and his ilk,
Right.
Do this too. What is this? They separate the form from the body.
Yes.
And the mathematician was able to consider just the form, because the mathematician is not studying anything qua a natural object.
Mm-hmm.
So taking away the looking at just the static form, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't do violence to the study of the mathematician. But thinking of natural bodies in terms of just the pure ideas does violence to thinking about natural bodies, because you've just, as it were, abstracted away from the nature of the thing, the inner principle of the thing.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, go ahead, Philip.
Well, okay. On page 23, right next to the number 10, for whereas geometry investigates natural lines.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems pretty clear that Aristotle does think that geometry investigates natural lines, but then he says, but not insofar as they're natural. So how can we make sense of that? One possible way is that yes, we're investigating natural lines, but we can consider them somewhat removed from their natural features.
Yeah.
So in other words, you don't have to make a leap into sort of cliche Platonism. I'm not going to take a stand on whether Plato was a cliche Platonist or not, but like one possibility is you could read this in a Platonic way or cliche Platonic way. That would go, well, whereas, okay, geometry investigates natural lines, but it only seems to do that, cliche Plato would say. Really, it's investigating these abstract entities that exist out there in some kind of metaphysical space. Okay, so I don't think Aristotle's doing that, but he is saying we're investigating natural lines. It's just you can consider them without many or most or almost all of their natural features.
Yes. Yeah.
It's separable in the mathematically speaking, naturality of the natural lines is separable from the lines part, and that's okay mathematically. It is not okay if you're thinking about if these are lines of flight of birds or something like that, because then you have to consider the motion of the birds. You couldn't separate just the shape of their motion from the study of their motion.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So, what was I going to say? I want to get this whole snub nose thing because I find it endlessly fascinating. But before I do that, Philip's jumping in.
I have to go a bit outside the text for this one. If that's not appropriate, let me know. But like when Aristotle considers counting and how there doesn't seem to be any limit on numbers that you can count, Aristotle seems to think that these numbers exist as you are counting them. Mm-hmm. So the number a gazillion and 3 exists as I'm counting it. It doesn't, for Aristotle, exist in some kind of abstract metaphysical space. It exists if and when I am counting it, which is bizarre, but also the alternatives are bizarre. Like the whole situation is just bizarre. And I think something similar could be happening here. Like there's a natural line, and the mathematical line appears as we do mathematics on the natural world.
That'll be really interesting to follow up on, especially when we get, because I haven't quite read that section of Aristotle yet, but it would be interesting, given his notions of first and second actuality and first and second potentiality. How does that play into these? Sort of exists only as I'm counting it or not? Is there anyway? It'll be interesting to think about that when it comes up.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. No, good point. So, I mean, I guess what I wanted to point out is this whole snub nose thing, right? If you think about the form of snub nose, you get into a problem because you're trying to abstract from the matter and just get at the form, but the matter reappears in the form. snub noses. And so he's making the point that there are, and in fact, physical, natural things. They can only be thought of in their essence as having the matter that they have. And so with them, every abstraction of essence from matter is going to lead to falsehoods. I think that's part of what he's accusing of the Platonic school of committing, that snub-nosedness has snubness in its form, and therefore the matter of its particularity belongs in the form and can't be taken out of it. And so what Aristotle is doing is he's showing that there's a whole realm of things that where you can't perform let's assume that this is what he thinks Plato is doing, that anything that is and that is determinate has not only a form, but a separable form, right? And that these have completely different properties than the things that have the forms. And here we begin to get, at least at a simplistic level, this two-world theory that's being collapsed. And the snub nose is always the example of how when you try to establish, study snubness, you're always going to be when you study a curve, you're not going to be studying this curve or this set of curves, right? You're studying any potential curve. But when you study snubness, you'll always be studying noses, because only noses are snub. And so the matter belongs to the form in a way that the mathematical properties don't belong to natural bodies, that makes them separable.
The snubness cannot be separated from nosedness.
Exactly.
But concavity can be thought of separate from the line. You can have concave surfaces as well, right? The concavity, right, in some sense, is separable from any of one of its things. You can consider that,
right?
The properties of concavity can't really. I mean, you can. Well, I guess you can consider in your mind maybe snubness is, but no, you can't, because snubness is only with respect to nose. So.
Exactly. I think that's it. That's his point. And he says, this escapes their notice.
Especially if you think of snubness as, oh, snubness means concavity. Now all of a sudden I'm off the races on illegitimately separating form from the nose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, what he says, that the problems that the Platonists did, they didn't notice that they had made that leap,
exactly,
out of the natural body, out of the nose and into the mathematical world, and then thought that,
right. And if we just contemplate momentarily, one of the many motivating reasons for the Platonists to do that is the question of knowledge beleaguered them, and changing things can't be known. And so it's only what's unchanging that can be known. And what's unchanging are the forms and all the logical properties that forms have, and all the inferential logical relationships that obtain between forms. Right? That's knowable. Right? But what changes all the time isn't knowable, because if I say this thing is red, and then tomorrow I wake up and it's blue, then my supposed knowledge is now not knowledge. And so knowledge must be universal and necessary, and universal and necessary knowledge cannot be obtained amongst things that change. And I think this chapter is incredibly important, because what Aristotle is doing is showing how the natural, sensible world can be known, even if you accept the criteria of knowledge, which he does, that Plato established. And that's why in this chapter he repeats over and over and over again what is always, or for the most part. There's a regularity to change. And that's how nature's knowable. So I just wanted to bring in that viewpoint as a way to kind of understand some of his arguments and why he emphasizes certain things. but nature is not knowable. It's like by transcending it to purely formal properties, because of the problems that things like snubness pose for that. And his point is anything that that it belongs to its essence to have an inner principle of motion will be well, that will the Platonic move will create falsehoods rather than truths, and so it won't be knowledge. Okay, I'm done. Philip?
I'm wondering if optics is the science that would be appropriate if we wanted to study snub-nosedness. Like, again, on page 23, at roughly the number 10, optics investigates mathematical lines, but not insofar as they are mathematical. So we've acknowledged that the snub nose has a curve to it, but we feel that that curve is not mathematical, and that seems to suggest that Aristotle is hinting that optics is what you would use to study snub-nosedness.
I don't know about that, but I don't have a real cogent reply just off the bat. Yeah, but what I think you're right on is definitely that snub-nosedness is a or anything that for which the form is essential to what it, sorry, the matter is essential to what it is only studyable and only knowable in a study of nature and not in a study of form. So maybe optics, maybe a number of sciences are required for snub-nosedness, because obviously whether something's a nose or not, optics isn't going to be able to tell you. Right, because we have to understand the function of the nose, and therefore whether this hunk of flesh can actually perform that that function. And even if it doesn't look like a human nose or an elephant nose, maybe it can still perform that function. Right, so we're going to need more than optics, but definitely the point holds that that it's at the level of nature and not at the level of the metaphysics of forms that such things will be knowable. Any other points you want to raise from that paragraph? I have to say, this conversation is very interesting, but as usual, we've made very little progress in this text. I have no idea how I'm supposed to speed up, but I mean, it is what it is, and we'll just roll with it until we don't want to roll with it anymore. Let's make that agreement.
I guess
all right.
One thing that I'm thinking of,
please,
is the difference between, let's say, like a pure science and an applied science, right? But it seems like from this paragraph, Aristotle is drawing a distinction between pure and applied differently than what's taught in universities, right? Like, I guess you could have pure optics and applied optics. But here it seems like what is a pure science would only be mathematics, where we completely divorce it from anything natural or anything snub-nosedness. And then everything else is applied, that belongs where we consider the natural world when we are investigating things mathematically, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't have that sounded right to me. Was there a question packed in there?
No, and I had to mute this because my
okay, gotcha.
Sorry.
That's all good. All right, let's just read a little bit more, and then let's just to see what is he after with this whole snub-nosedness and the mathematicians, right? And it seems like he gets to it in this next paragraph. So let's read it and see if we can make sense of what step is he making in the unfolding of the physics. He's been very methodical. Right? Is there change? If so, how is it to be understood, right? And then once we've understood what change is, we get at the kinds of change, and And so he's exploring, right? So what is it that the natural scientist, the one who studies change, is most looking for? Is it form or matter or both? The answer is not obvious, so it needs to be inquired into. And he begins this now with the next paragraph. Since nature is twofold, form and also matter, we should get a theoretical grasp on it as if we were investigating what snugness is, so that we should get a theoretical grasp on natural things, neither without their matter nor with regard to their matter alone. For of course there might be a puzzle about this, since there are two natures as to which is the concern of the natural scientist. Or is he concerned with a combination of the two? But if with the combination of the two, he is also concerned with each one of them. Does it belong to the same science then, or to distinct ones, to know each of them? So his answer is going to be based on craft and nature, or art and technique and nature. So before we get there, I see Philip's hand. Go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize a point I made before, like that very first line, since nature is twofold, form and also matter. I just want to emphasize this kind of Peter's point from before, is that there's no need to make a metaphysical leap here, right? You can just say nature is twofold, and this twofoldness shows up as we consider nature. Right. So you don't have to have a metaphysical form out there and a metaphysical matter out there. Just wanted to emphasize that.
No, I appreciate that. And we always have, we have to remember the whole time, why are we even talking about form and matter, right? It's because it was the only way to formulate the account of change that was consistent. So if we just look at language, right, something becomes something, that sometimes referred to things that are changing. Sometimes it refers to things that aren't changing. And at other times it refers to things that only seem to change but aren't. And so the linguistic formula, something becomes something, is ambiguous. And when we use it, we cannot be sure that we are referring to something that is actually changing because of its inner ambiguity. So he took different examples of language and showed how that would sometimes capture change, and other times it would capture so-called simple becoming, which is the unmusical becoming musical, which leaves a gap in between the two. And so you actually don't have anything changing here, but you have one thing disappearing and another one popping into existence. So when we say something's changing, we mean one thing. But the many examples that are linguistic formula, something becomes something, leads us to think is, well, it's not one thing gaining new properties, but in fact, it's two things. It's what it was before, what's something before and something after. So Aristotle's whole point is that language is ambiguous. Change is said in many ways, and in fact, it's often said in a way that leads us to contradictory results, and that's what Parmenides showed. So if we're going to really mean what we say when we say something changes, right? We can't just read it off of our language. We need a self-consistent concept or a self-consistent account such that when we use it, it's unambiguous and it always captures change in the way we intended it in the first place. So we use change, the word change, but the use of that word sometimes refers to change and sometimes it doesn't. But what we really want to do is we want to think change. We want to capture change when we use the word change. So we have to go beyond the mere linguistic formulation to the proper account of change. And the proper account required the use of matter, form, and lack. And it's only because of that we need matter, form, and lack to consistently think change. And so therefore, anything that is changing is going to be involved with matter, form, and lack. And that's why we have to deal with these things. They've been imported through our concept of change, right? Now, and that's why we have now all of these puzzles that seem like, well, this isn't physics, right? But what we're doing is we are fleshing out and articulating the understanding of change that is contained in that account. And as we flesh that out, we understand change more. And as we understand change more, we understand more about the things that change. And so when we talk about the account, we're not just talking about language. We're not talking about any mental representations. It's a third thing. It's something completely different. And so it's just another one of my pleas that we don't get locked into the subject-object Cartesian model when Aristotle does marvelously without it. All right, so that was my little parenthetical remark about why is it we're talking about form and matter all the time. Right. Okay. So, let's look and see if we can understand a little bit about what Aristotle, how he answers the question, right? Is the natural scientist concerned with the combination of the two? And if he's concerned with the combination, isn't he also concerned with each one of them, form and matter? But it seems like it might be obvious what the answer should be given how the account is constituted, but let's see what he does here. So skipping down a little bit after Empedocles and Democritus. If, on the other hand, craft imitates nature, and if it belongs to the same science to know the form and up to the point, the matter, for example, it belongs to the doctor to know health and also bile and phlegm, in which health resides, and to the builder to know the form of a house and also the matter, that it is bricks and beams, and similarly in the case of the others, then it belongs to the natural scientist to know both natures. Further, let me see, do I want to read this? It's not too much, it's not too long. The knowledge of the for the sake of which, the end, that is the end, sorry, belongs to the same science as knowledge of the things that are for its sake. But nature is an end and a for the sake of which. For whenever a continuous movement has a certain end of its movement, this is a last thing and the for the sake of which. That is why the poet spoke ridiculously when he said, quote, he has reached the end for which he was born, end quote. Since by end, we mean not every last thing, but the best one. For the crafts produce their matter, some unconditionally, while others make it good relative to the function. And we make use of all things as if they were there for us, since we are also, in a way, an end. For the end is twofold, as we said on philosophy. All right, so what do you understand? What has he done with these paragraphs? Peter.
I just want to point out that when he says like when emotion, the bottom of that page, a continuous movement has a certain end of its movement. This is the last thing in that thing, and for the sake of which. I just want to point out that if you have a tree growing and its movement is its growth, and a lumberjack comes and cuts down the tree and it falls over, the falling over is not part of the natural movement of the tree.
Right.
It is already.
Sorry, you cut out. It is what? Whoops, I can't hear anything. Oh, okay. Peter, when you get your mic back, chime in. Anybody else?
So just to continue where Peter was going before he got cut off, when the tree falls, when it dies, it's falling not because of its own nature,
right,
as a source of movement. And now it's falling because it's subject to gravity or whatever. And I don't know if that's where.
No. But let's think. Obviously, Aristotle didn't have gravity. I know you know that, but it is made of earth, and
Yes,
right,
yes.
and so when its treeness, right, the growth that is characteristic of the tree, when that is forced to cease through the violent intervention of the axe, right, then it's no longer the nature of the tree that accounts for the movement, but the nature of the elements it's composed of. Right.
Yep.
Then they're doing their thing too. It's just that Earth doesn't do tree things. Earth just falls. And so, but trees do tree things. And so even though they're composed of earth, they don't just fall. They grow and they develop and then they decay. And so to speak, reducing it to its elements, earth, air, fire, and water, does it account for the way in which it moves as a tree? Okay, so that's the point he's continually making. What accounts for a thing's motion if it has an intrinsic motion? Go ahead, Peter. See you back. Oh no, sorry, that's my bad. That's Philip. Go ahead, Philip.
Well, I am back, and I'm glad that you seem to have picked up on what I was trying to say.
Okay.
If Peter's back and wants to finish his point, please let him go first.
Thanks, Philip. Peter.
Well, I apparently my network is just, it's been crappy all day. But anyway, sorry about that. But it looks like it seems like when I joined, Michael was making my point, so I assume he made it.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks. No, but I was only doing my best to do justice to what you said. So thanks. Philip.
Okay, so at the top of page 24 in the Reeve, Aristotle says something I find very confusing. For the crafts produce their matter, some unconditionally, while others make it good relative to the function. Now, I have a pretty good sense of what it means for a craftsman or craftsperson to have a sense of the telos, of having a sense of the function. I can't make much sense of what it would mean for a craft to be oblivious of the function of what they're doing. The best I can come up with is a slave who is doing some task mindlessly, has no idea why they're shoveling this or why they're rowing the oar or whatever. But I'm really stretching to find a way to make that make sense. Can anybody make a more natural sense of that line?
I can't right off the bat. Does anybody else have want to take a stab?
Could it be the difference between a craftsperson making art for art's sake, as opposed to, let's say, a home builder building a home whose function is to be a home?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It's like, is it, art for its own sake, or art, you creating an artifact that is designed to serve some function that was there, like forks are for eating, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's good. Seems like there must be something, and I wanted to say like a painter who makes his canvases, but I mean he's making it good relative to the function of being painted on, right? So that's not. I'm not quite sure what he's referring to this unconditionally. Philip, you want to follow up?
Yeah, I think the idea of art for art's sake is really alien to the Greeks. I mean, they didn't. It just doesn't seem that was what they could be getting at. Like it seems more like a craftsperson who makes things good relative to a function would be somebody who makes a coat, and they're very aware of what the function of the coat is, and perhaps that perhaps they do want to make it artistic, perhaps they want to make it attractive, but the fact that it is there to keep you warm is part and parcel. Like they just simply didn't have art for art's sake. They'd have art for the gods, which might be as close as they get to art for art's sake. Like, I get it that they could have art that's removed from human needs, but they would be there for the needs of the gods, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's it just occurred to me that maybe we can think of this as right, somebody who turns trees into timber. Now, timber has many different functions, and so the craftsman person who's making the timber isn't making it for a particular function. He's just making timber, or he's making 2x4s, and
Standing reserves.
Exactly, but there's no specific function that right. It's no specific function that he's doing it. He's not tailoring it towards ships or towards houses or towards statues. So that's my taking a stab at it. Philip?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. The idea of, like shoveling the gravel, that could be used for anything, but there could be a better and a worse way, a more craftsman-like way and a less craftsman-like way to shovel gravel or something. So yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Right, but I just want to distinguish, shoveling gravel is an act, but it's not an act of production, so it wouldn't be a techne for the Greeks.
I agree. I felt it was a bad example as I was saying it. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we keep all the distinctions clear. Sometimes we run them together, pressed for time, or whatever. I get it. All right. So does it? What sense does anybody make, if any? Oh, I see Charlie's hand, but I'm just going to ask my question about this whole craft and nature imitating one another. I kind of want to get to it, but if we don't get to it this time, we'll get to it next time. Charlie?
I'm following a translation by Richard McKeon, with an introduction by Reeve. That is translated here as, for the arts make their material, parenthesis, some simply make it, others make it serviceable, in parenthesis, and we use everything as if it was there for our sake.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of the sense that you said that some of the artists make the material, others make it into something serviceable. And
mm-hmm. Right. So the craftsman who makes a rudder does it according to the captain's needs, right? And so there, the function is going into the rudder in a way. Even if the rudder is made of timber, right? The timber's got to be produced first for many different needs.
Or some make a pile of bricks and then others make it serviceable.
Exactly. I'll be right back. Sorry.
What was Michael's other question? I had an answer to it, but I forgot what the question was now.
It was something about
craft.
The nature of the crafts.
Oh, difference between the artifact and nature, right?
Yeah.
Where the nature has its form comes from within the thing that has that nature, whereas for an artifact or a craft, the form of the produced object comes from the artisan, right? The artisan has the form of fork and then turns the metal into a fork. Trees are the things that keep themselves tree-like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, their nature.
I'm starting to have my doubts now about the idea that there could be a craftsman who makes things that are like standing reserve, as one person said. It seems that even that, like let's say somebody makes 2x4s, it seems that at the very least those have a range of functions. Like, for example, you're not going to make a spoon out of it. Well, maybe you might. Like somebody who makes, it just seems like there's going to be a range of functions that maybe I'm getting hung up on the word some unconditionally, and I'm putting too much on that. Like later philosophy gets really, really unconditional things active in the philosophy, but maybe Aristotle isn't pushing it quite that much. Like maybe it's a.
I wonder.
We're not a Hegelian unconditional, if that's what you mean.
Exactly. I mean, we could really go to town on the word unconditionally, but I don't think we should. So maybe the 2x4s count as not having a function. I find it hard to say that somebody who makes 2x4s did it without there being any. Like, it seems like those 2x4s have a range of functions, and that range itself counts as a function.
I wonder if the difference, because what I hear with these examples is that these craftspeople are building things at different stages, right? You have your 2x4s, then you have your whatever comes after 2x4s, like a wall, and then the house. And I'm wondering if the distinction might be a little different. For example, you could have a craftsperson building a vase or vase, whatever, with like a gold inlay, and it's made out of the finest china, and it's, they've created their own paints to paint on it. And if you were to use that as a regular vase, like put plants in it, they'd say, what are you, dumb? Like, this is made unconditionally for its own sake. Whereas another craftsperson can create a vase out of, I don't know, plastic, cheap plastic. And in that case, it really would be used as a vase.
Well, think about the materials for making a vase. Clay, that's pretty much unformed. That's not for its own sake, right? So the person who makes clay is doing it unconditionally, and then somebody takes clay, makes it into a vase or plate or mug or whatever. Same thing with paint and colors. Anyway, but I thought the other question was also more interesting, the one difference between artifacts and natural things.
Yes, I mean, one way to interpret this is to say that functionality could be a question of degree, right? So the specialized vase or vase, which has the gold inlay, okay, that is a very specific function, whereas the person, you could imagine a craftsperson who makes very high quality clays versus somebody else who makes low quality clays. And you could still say that the high quality clay has a function, but it's a less specific function. So, I mean, Aristotle could be getting at a distinction between very specialized functions and less specialized functions. It's not what he actually says, but, I think we should be generous when interpreting him. That might be what he's saying.
We can think of certain. We can think of certain crafts. Aquinas gives the example of a tile maker. I make tiles. And making tiles is a techne. And tiles, in order to be tiles, have to be a certain way, regardless of the function that they're employed for later on, whether decorative or useful or whatever, right? So with at least with this, maybe the timber one is ambiguous, but let's see if we can run with Aquinas's. The maker of the tiles makes them to be tiles, right? And that anybody that can has a function for these tiles will be able to use them in that specific function. So I wouldn't necessarily want to go degrees. I would want to say the techne makes a product that it has an idea of about how to bring materials together in such a way that the form is realized in the materials. Bam, that's just craft making unconditionally, or the Greek is haplo, simply, right? It just makes it simply without any qualification. It's not tiles for this or tiles for that. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Yep.
Yeah, that's also sort of the sense of, if you go back to Reeves' footnote on 164, he's talking about where the function is the end and the activity is the function. So when you're making a fork, it is for, you're imposing the form on the metal for the purpose of eating. Whereas the person who makes the metal, in some sense, is just making a raw material, not really a raw material, slightly processed material, but still it's not for a particular function, because making stuff with this is not really a particular function. There's no particular thing that is the end.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice with the metal. All the metal has to do is be metal.
Yeah. Or clay is clay.
It doesn't have to function over against that. Yeah, go ahead, Clark.
Yeah. So there's, I mean, with techne, my experience is that at every stage of techne, there's stages of techne, and those stages can be looked at as having unitariness of their own. They can be
unity.
So I am putting something together, and if I don't treat the exact artifact that I'm working on right now with its fullest integrity, then if I want to use it in something that is used in combination with to create another techne object, these stages all have their own integrity. My question kind of is what makes it good relative to the function? So is that so what I'm thinking is the way to think about this in terms of, potential and actuality. So if I'm a craftsperson, I decide when it is made good relative to its function. Others make it good relative to the function. So the potential, the actuality is determined by the craftsperson.
Right. That's interesting. I was just thinking
actuality and potential. Yeah.
So there's different ways to make tiles, and every tile maker has their own skills and their own materials and all the rest of it, right? But the person who wants them to fulfill a particular function, right, is going to go to the tile maker who makes tiles that fills that function. If it needs a more brittle tile because he wants to make a mosaic of his floor or something like that, he's going to go to the one whose materials are more brittle. And so it is, so the potential of the tile to fulfill a function is kind of dependent on the way it's made, because that's going to limit the kinds of potential things. Yeah, it's going to limit the number of actualizations that are possible from it. I don't know. Does that address what you're saying, or are you doing something else?
Yeah. No. That's said it better than I said it. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice of you. Thanks. Oh, Mike. Yeah.
I have a question. So natural sciences, can we say then, are concerned with form and matter?
Yes.
So then I apologize for my dogs. They're acting up. But so I have a question about like physics. So most of the physics I've studied, if not all, considers objects as point objects. And I think a lot has been done from there, right? Like when we think of the heavenly bodies, I don't think we consider them as having any extension. At least looking at it classically, and they're just point objects. So then to me, what I take, and they're not rotating or anything. So to me, what that leads me to believe is that we're not considering the form, right? We're just considering the matter. And yet by doing that, we still made a lot of progress, or made a lot of forward progress in our understanding. But now I'm thinking, if that's the case, is like natural science in the guise of physics kind of like an aborted or not fully formed natural science then? Or like what do you think's going on there?
Interesting. Well, I think that I just want to say that I think they're two different projects, and one is to know what things are, and the other is to understand them in terms of their predictability and their mathematical formulatability. And the latter gives us a great deal of power over things, but not much of an understanding of what they are. And that manifests in, the contradictions between between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, between waves and particles, and entanglement and causality, all these fundamental inconsistencies of the theory, which don't matter that much because it still works, right? And so the nature of things is obscured, but in terms of what it's there for, namely practical value, it's very wonderful. And so in studying Aristotle's physics, I don't want anybody to think that we should go back to being Aristotelian physicists and that we should get rid of modern physics. Just the contrary, we need and we love modern physics. But we have to understand their difference and whether the difference entails an obscuring of the nature of things. And that's kind of my question, and the urgency of my question is, if there's an obscuring, what's the remedy? How far does the obscuring go? Does it mean that it's impossible for us to comprehend ourselves? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's good for the human being? These more fundamental questions. So I love modern physics. I love modern science. We need them. We do not need to replace them with anything Greek. But when we ask, what is real? What is true? We're asking a set of questions that are orthogonal to natural science. And I always make the point, probably ad nauseum, right? That reality and truth and knowledge, these aren't variables in any scientific theory. There's no scientific theory that pontificates about them. There's always, it's meta science where people draw inferences from scientific theories and scientific practice, and then they draw inferences and they try to say something about reality, which is undefinable in an empirical science, and about truth and about knowledge and all the rest of it. So it's this transformation of science which abstracts from being into a theory of being that I particularly object to. And so that's why the Greeks are so interesting, is not because they would be better physicists, far from it, but because their question is more existential. What is? What are we? How do we go about even thinking this and making progress? Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Thank you. That helps.
Yeah, I guess Michael made some of my points I was going to make. Number one, that the word physics appears on the cover of the book we're reading. It also appears on Tipler's Modern Physics, or whatever it was kids learn these days in college. Tipler's was my calculus-based physics introduction. Anyway, those are different things. Most notably, in the modern physics, you're not going to have anything. Not everything that has an inner principle of motion is studied in modern physics, because trees and plants and people, qua natural objects, natural things, are not studied in today's modern physics. So there's definitely a different overlap there. Mm-hmm. And then the way that the modern physics approaches the matter is also different than the philosophical approach. It's one's doing philosophy, one's doing natural, modern day use of natural science.
So let me see. I see Philip's hand. Hold on one second. I think everybody's going to be taking off now. So let us do next time, which is 2 weeks from now. We have an opportunity to digest more of this. It's also, anyway, 2 weeks from now, what I would love to do is spend one half of our time talking about luck and chance, and the other half of our time talking about the for the sake of which at the end of this book. All right.
Well, good luck trying to limit it.
Yeah, no, okay, but maybe if
that's just a pun.
People help me. I'm setting parameters here, right? Luck and chance, 1 hour, and then the for the sake of which at the second hour. And really, I'm trying to get, what is the scope of it, and what allows us to make inferences back and forth between craft and nature when the book starts off with their distinction, with their respective otherness. Right? And so I want to get at that question because it's an illuminating thing to pursue in Aristotle. So then we will be done with the physics for our purposes, and we will be going back to the metaphysics. So really want to make a end run next time. And so if people have to leave, you're more than welcome to leave. I wanted to let you know what we're doing. 2 weeks from now, 1 week from now, we're going to do our informal session, and we're going to be beginning our Schmidt reading. So that's going to be very, very cool, and I hope everybody can join. That's the end of my announcements. I'm going to hit whoever's recording can cease recording. And Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, it's one thing to